On the afternoon of October 16th, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez bent down, pulled out his pocket knife, and he carefully cut through the stem of a mushroom that was growing right next to a mossy log. And then after freeing this mushroom, he put it inside of his wicker basket with the other mushrooms he had collected in the area. And then Enrique stood up and just took a minute to take in the unbelievable view of this lush green valley right below him. Enrique was out mushroom hunting along with his wife Anna and their two friends Jorge and Sofia, who were dating. And where they were mushroom hunting was near this old abandoned town called La Musara, which is located up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It had been Jorge's idea to come to this area and explore. Jorge had heard all these crazy stories about La Musara, about how it was haunted, and there was all this creepy folklore surrounding this town. As for Enrique, he didn't really care about the lore surrounding this town. Frankly, the town was not that interesting to him. What was interesting was the opportunity to come out here and collect mushrooms. That was something he really liked to do. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in this very busy port city in Spain called Tarragona, and so their lives day to day were very hectic. Enrique, he worked at a bar as a bartender, and so every night he was surrounded by hundreds of people coming in and out. And so having a chance to come out here and be in nature at peace and collect these mushrooms just sounded too good to turn up. Enrique stopped staring at the valley right in front of him, and he turned around and continued to scan the mountainside for a particular type of mushroom that grew in this area. It was called the bloody milk cap, which was known to be great for grilling. It paired well with meat. And so Enrique's plan was to go out on this mushroom hunting trip, and when they got back, he wanted to cook a feast using these mushrooms for his wife and his friends. The group slowly made their way uphill until they finally saw the outskirts of the abandoned town, La Musara. La Musara was more than 900 years old, and now it was just a collection of crumbling ruins, some dating back to prehistoric times. La Musara had never been a big town. At its peak, it had about 300 residents. But the last of the remaining residents of this town had finally fled 40 years earlier, and so now it was a ghost town. The group made their way over to one of the buildings that was right on the outer perimeter of La Musara. It was basically just a foundation with 3 walls still standing. There was no roof. But the friends, they went over to this building, and from right next to it, they were able to look straight down the main drag of La Musara. It was basically just a dirt road that went straight out, and all along the road were other kind of ruined foundations of where buildings used to be. And fairly far down this road, maybe 200 feet away from where all the friends were standing, was the center of La Musara, which was marked by this big church with a huge steeple, and the church was actually in decent shape. It had not totally crumbled onto itself like the rest of the buildings around it. And then behind the church, somewhat visible from where the friends were standing, was this overgrown cemetery. And then kind of off to the side of the church was this pond that was also very overgrown, and it was full of croaking frogs. Enrique and his friends just stood there next to their dilapidated building, staring at La Musara in silence. Now, they knew this place was going to be very creepy. People had said it was haunted, and that was a big reason why Jorge wanted to come here. But now seeing it in person, really the creep factor was much higher than they expected. It really did look like a spooky place. And then adding to the spook factor was very clearly, as they were looking down this main road, the friends could see this mist kind of starting to envelop the town. Jorge had told the friends when he was doing his research about La Musara that the mist was really a trademark of this town, that at night it basically got completely consumed in white mist. But now the friends are looking down this road, it's the middle of the day, and already the mist is starting to come in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." And he grabbed his girlfriend Sofia's hand, and he began kind of jogging down the main road in the direction of the church. And so Enrique and Anna followed behind. And after only walking maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique happened to turn around and look back where they had just been standing next to this dilapidated building, and already he couldn't see that building because this fog had rolled in and totally obscured his view. Enrique couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, again, because he thought the fog was supposed to come in at night, and it's broad daylight, and here we are, totally covered in fog, but he shook it off, thinking, what's the big deal? And so Enrique turned back around, and he and Anna hustled to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who by this point had stopped a little farther down the road, off to the side, where there was this strange rectangular rock that was maybe 2 feet tall, just kind of jutting up out of the ground. And when Enrique and Anna made it to Jorge and Sofia, Jorge placed his hand on the top of this strange rock, and looking very satisfied with himself, he would tell his friends, "This is the Sis Stone, and people say it contains dark powers." The Sis Stone was actually one of the oldest things in all of La Musara. Back in the day, Muslim armies used to march through La Musara, which actually got its name from this. La Musara means the place to march. And so these armies, as they would pass through La Musara, making their way to the valley down below, they would always stop at the Sis Stone because they believed it had magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in their upcoming battles. Now, the Muslim armies were long gone by this point, but the Sis Stone was still there, and people still said that it contained that kind of magical power, that there were dark forces at work inside of the stone, and so to touch it was very risky. In fact, some people said if you touched the Sis Stone, you could be sucked into this parallel world full of all these demonic entities. And so as Jorge told the group about all this history surrounding the Sis Stone and how no one should touch it, remember, he's got his hands squarely on the Sis Stone the whole time. And so when he finishes telling the story, he looks at the others and said, "Come on, somebody else touch it." Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, said, "Absolutely not. I'm not about to tempt evil spirits here." But Enrique's wife, Anna, said, "You know what? I'll touch it." And so Jorge smiled, he pulled his hand off the Sis Stone, and Anna, she walked forward, she took a deep breath, and then she placed her hand on the stone. And for a second, the whole group just held their breath, like something was going to reach out and grab Anna and pull her into the stone, but nothing happened, and a minute later, Anna had pulled her hand off, and the whole group was laughing. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique, who had been laughing along with the group, suddenly noticed that the frogs in the pond near the church, a little farther down the road from where they were suddenly so much louder. It was almost like when they touched the stone, it had maximized the volume of these frogs. And so Enrique, he turned his whole body and began staring down the road through the mist and fog at this pond, and he could kind of barely make it out. You know, he was trying to see if there was something obvious causing these frogs to kind of go crazy. But as he stared at this pond, which again he could barely see, right behind it was the church. But there was lots of fog kind of blocking the church, and for a second the fog kind of parted, and Enrique got a full shot of one of the windows of this abandoned church. And in the window was this dark figure just standing there staring at Enrique and his friends. And Enrique, he sees this thing in the window, and in a second it was gone. And then the fog rolled back in, covered up the window, and Enrique couldn't see anything anymore. And so Enrique just stood there in stunned silence, having no idea if what he just saw had really just happened or if it was in his imagination or something. But before he could even try to process what had just happened, he heard his name being called. And so he kind of snapped out of it, and he turned back to the group, and it was Anna, who was now jokingly saying, "Come on, Enrique, touch the stone too." Enrique quickly scanned Anna, Sofia, and Jorge's face, and they were all smiling and laughing still, and so clearly none of them had seen this figure in the window. And so Enrique, he kind of just looked at all of his friends, and then he looked back in the direction of the church and this window, which again he couldn't see because the fog was blocking it out. And so Enrique just tells himself, okay, there's no way that I just saw some dark figure moving around this abandoned church. You know, that must have been my imagination. I'm totally fine. And so he turned back to his friends, and he could tell they were not going to let it go until he touched the stone. And so he said, fine, and he walked up and he touched the stone. And immediately, as soon as his hand made contact with that stone, everything seemed to change. The air around Enrique got cooler, and the stone itself started to warm up. And as this happened, Enrique, whose hand was still on the stone, began to think, wow, I could do this for hours. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. I mean, this is amazing. But then somewhere buried deep in his mind, Enrique began telling himself, get away from the stone. Take your hand away, get away right now. And so finally, Enrique did yank his hand away, and right away all those feelings he was having as he touched the stone disappeared. The air went back to normal. He did not feel compelled to touch the stone, and he just kind of was left thinking, what just happened? And so Enrique's wife, Anna, along with Jorge, they were both grinning at Enrique, waiting for him to tell them about what it was like to touch the Sis Stone. But behind them, Sofia, Jorge's girlfriend, she was not happy. She was the only one who had not touched the Sis Stone. And so she spoke up and said, guys, let's get away from the Sis Stone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go. And so Jorge threw his arm around Sophia and told her to lighten up, and then said, come on, let's do some more exploring. And so Jorge took Sophia's hand, and he continued walking down the main road in the direction of the church, and Enrique's wife, Anna, she quickly followed right after them, kind of running to keep up, like she was a kid who was excited about what they were doing. But Enrique, he just stayed put for an extra second, because even though he had told himself that, whatever he saw in the window was nothing, he could not help the fact that as soon as he touched that cistone, he felt different. There was something off about the stone, and really there seemed to be something off about this whole village, which by this point was now completely enveloped in fog. They were totally covered. Now, Enrique, at this point, did just want to leave La Musara. He didn't want to be there anymore. The place was totally creeping him out. But he didn't want to be a party pooper, and so he turned and continued walking down the main road after his friends and his wife. And after he walked a little ways, the fog parted enough that he could see the pond full of these very loud croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he had seen or supposedly seen this dark figure, but the window was empty. And Enrique was relieved to see that his friends clearly had not stopped at the church. They had not tried to go in. They had gone behind the church into the cemetery. Enrique did not want to go inside of the church because even though, again, he had told himself that, that figure wasn't real, it wasn't really in the window, still there was a part of him that wanted to stay far away from this building. But after Enrique walked past the pond and began side-skirting the church to get to the cemetery, he just stopped and turned and actually faced the window, kind of like involuntarily. He was looking at the window where this dark figure had been. And again, it's empty, there's nothing there, but Enrique felt like something was pulling him towards this window. And so without saying anything to his friends, who weren't really paying attention to Enrique, they're kind of just walking around the cemetery, Enrique walked right up to this window. He's right in front of it. He's looking inside, and now he can see into the actual church. And it's totally ruined inside, but he can see where the pews used to be on the ground, and he could also see where the pulpit used to be, where the priest would give mass. And as Enrique stood there staring into the church, he kept leaning closer and closer and closer into the church until finally he felt like he really wanted to move away and get away from the church, but it was like he couldn't. He just kept getting pulled into this opening. And then as this was happening, the sound of the frogs got louder and louder until Enrique felt like he was totally consumed by these frogs. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church and back in the cemetery, Anna, Jorge, and Sophia were kind of laughing and walking around the cemetery, reading the different headstones, when at some point, Anna, Enrique's wife, just happened to look up when she realized Enrique was not there with them. And so Anna, she walked over to the gate of the cemetery and she looked up along the side of the church, and there was Enrique kind of leaning forward into this window looking into the church. And so Anna, she yelled out to him a couple of times, but Enrique did not even notice her or acknowledge her. He just continued leaning forward looking in this window. And finally, Anna got right up next to Enrique and she actually shook his shoulder. And when she did that, Enrique kind of snapped out of it and turned and looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just had this totally confused look on his face. And Anna, she looks up at her husband and she's like, come on, come into the cemetery. That's where everyone is. Come on. And then Anna turned and skipped towards the cemetery. And once Anna was back in the cemetery, she just got right back to walking around and looking at all the different headstones. And at some point, as she was looking at one particular headstone, she took a few steps back to get a better look at it, and she accidentally bumped into another headstone, a big cross that had a line drawn across it, and it fell to the ground and it broke. Jorge and Sophia heard the sound of this stone breaking in half, and they turned and looked at Anna, and they kind of quickly understood what had happened. And Jorge, he just started laughing at her, and he said, oh boy, now you've upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together. Now, Anna was trying to make light of this, but she was totally panicking and did not like the fact that she had just desecrated a gravesite in a potentially haunted town. And so she began picking up the headstone and trying to put the stone back on top, but it was no use. It was totally broken. And so as Anna continued to fumble with this headstone, and as Jorge continued to laugh and harass her about all the evil spirits that were going to attack her because of what she did, Jorge's girlfriend, Sophia, who was right next to him, she started getting on edge, and she said, hey, Jorge, is it true that this place is haunted? I mean, really, is this actually a haunted town? I mean, what's the deal? And Jorge, at this point, he stops laughing at Anna, and he turns to Sophia, and he goes, yeah, I think this place really is haunted. And then he would tell them the story of how La Musara came to be known as a haunted town. Back in October of 1873, there was a civil war happening in this part of Spain. And one of the rival armies was using the caves in the mountainside kind of near La Musara as sort of makeshift field hospitals for their wounded. And one night, a very famous general named Cercos was wounded in battle. He was brought into one of these caves, and that was where he died. Now, Cercos was a beloved leader, and so the people inside of this cave really wanted to give him a proper burial, but they knew they had to keep his death a secret, because if it got out to the rest of the men that their leader had died, it would be totally demoralizing and it would really give their enemies a victory. And so the 6 people inside of this cave, they built a coffin and placed Cercos inside of it. And then early the next morning, when it was still dark out, these 6 carried the coffin with Cercos inside of it up into La Musara, and they buried him secretly in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 armed rival soldiers climbed up the mountain into La Musara to look for General Cercos. They didn't know that he had died in that battle. In fact, really, besides those 6 people that saw him die and secretly buried him, nobody knew he was dead. And so these soldiers actually thought Cercos was hiding out in La Musara. And so these soldiers began busting into all the civilians' homes in La Musara and ripping them apart, looking for this general. And they'd send the people out into the streets and tell them they're going to kill them unless they give up information about where this general is. And finally, after about an hour of this, an elderly man who lived in La Musara had just had enough, and he stepped forward and he told the rival soldiers that General Cercos was dead, that he was buried in the cemetery behind their church. But the rival soldiers didn't believe the man. They said, okay, show us proof. But the elderly man said, well, I don't know exactly where he was buried in the cemetery. I just heard that's where he was buried. And so the soldier said, okay, get everybody over to the cemetery right now. And so all the townspeople made their way over to the cemetery, and the soldiers followed them. And then once they were there, the soldiers demanded that the townspeople begin basically digging up all the graves to find Cercos. And as the townspeople began to dig, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder, until finally the leader of these rival soldiers actually stepped away from all the chaos happening in the cemetery and walked over to the pond and began firing his gun into the water to get the frogs to stop. But they wouldn't. They actually only got louder and louder. And so the leader of these rival soldiers finally just gives up on trying to quiet down these frogs, and he turns around and walks back into the cemetery, and he finds all the townspeople have stopped digging. They've basically dug up every grave, and they haven't found Cercos, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. But the leader, as he looked across this graveyard, he noticed there was one grave that very conspicuously had not been touched. Everything around it had been dug up, but not this. No one had touched that grave. And so the leader said, go, dig that one up. But immediately the townspeople kind of took a step back and acted like, no way, we're not going near that grave. And so finally, a townsperson actually stepped forward and said to the leader of these rival soldiers that that grave contained this old woman who had died recently, who everyone suspected of being a witch. And so it was dangerous to try to dig her up. But the rival soldiers did not care at all about this. They just raised their guns and demanded the townspeople dig that grave up immediately. And so they would. They would go over, they would unearth this coffin, and then the rival soldiers would pop open the lid. And as soon as it was open, everybody went silent. Because this woman, who had died weeks earlier, looked totally preserved. She was laying on her back, and her skin was very pale, but it had not begun to rot yet. Even her cheeks still had a kind of pinkish hue to them, and her lips were open partway, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what really had startled the group into silence was this woman's eyes were wide open when they opened up this coffin. It looked like she was looking directly at all of them. And so after a couple of seconds of the silence from seeing this woman for the first time, the townspeople began to cry and scream and back up away from this coffin. And the rival soldiers, they were startled too by this woman's appearance, but they were more angry than anything else, because by finding this woman in this grave, it meant they had not found the general. And so out of frustration, the rival soldiers grabbed this old woman's body, this witch's body, and they pulled her out of her grave, they strung her up to a tree, and they just sat there shooting at her constantly until her body had basically been obliterated by all the bullets. And then finally, when the soldiers stopped shooting, they realized everything had gone quiet. just a second earlier, the cacophony of these frogs croaking in the pond that had been so loud it was like totally overwhelming had now completely ceased, and it was like the town had gone absolutely still. And this stillness and quietness was so unsettling for these soldiers that they actually just turned and fled right there without saying a word to the townspeople. And then once the soldiers were all gone, the townspeople got to work reburying their dead. And at some point, one of the townspeople jumped into the grave where the witch had been, and when they landed in the dirt at the bottom, their foot actually sunk down an extra foot. They had landed on something hollow and crashed into it. And what it was another coffin. There was another coffin buried below this woman's that the soldiers had not seen. And this secret coffin belonged to General Serkos. When those 6 people had secretly buried General Serkos, they had just placed his coffin at the bottom of an open grave that was about to be filled with somebody else's coffin. They put it in, they covered up his coffin with enough dirt that no one could see it, and then the next day, the townspeople lowered the witch in her coffin into that grave without realizing General Serkos was below it, and then they filled it in, and then they placed a headstone on her grave, but because they thought she was a witch, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. And so after this incident with the rival soldiers desecrating this woman's grave and her body, La Musara was never the same. People in the town began dying left and right, and their soil went bad, so they couldn't plant any crops, and then all these insects came through the town, and then all these plagues of illnesses and diseases came through. And so it wasn't long before La Musara had developed this reputation of being cursed. And by the 1950s, that curse apparently had driven the last few people out, officially making it a ghost town. After Jorge wrapped up the story, Anna was just horrified looking straight down at the ground, because it would turn out the gravestone that she had accidentally knocked over and broken, well, it had a horizontal line etched across the middle of it. It was the witch's headstone. That was the one she had broken. And so suddenly feeling totally spooked, Anna was about to yell to Jorge and Sofia that she wants to leave now, when she happened to glance over at the base of one of the cemetery walls, and she saw the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom, the exact type she knew her husband was looking for. And so Anna walked over, she picked this mushroom, and she turned around to show it to Enrique, but Enrique was not in the cemetery. And so right away, Anna thought, wait, did my husband ever actually follow me back down into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he followed her, but she wasn't sure. And so Anna yelled out for Enrique, but he never called back. And so she turned and looked over at Sofia and Jorge, who she could barely see through the fog, and she asked them, hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? And they both said, no, we have no idea. And so Anna, who at this point was now really starting to panic because this whole situation in La Musara was getting pretty spooky for her, and so she just dropped the mushroom and took off running out of the cemetery. Now, Sofia and Jorge did not really know what was going on. They didn't understand the urgency that Anna was feeling to find Enrique, and so they saw her take off to go find Enrique, and they just kind of casually walked on after her. And when they turned the corner and they exited the cemetery and began walking basically alongside the church, now again, the visibility is terrible from all this fog, as they moved along, they couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear Anna calling out for Enrique over and over again. And as they moved, Sofia and Jorge, they would see these shadows moving around in the fog. And they would think it was Enrique or Anna, but as they got up to where these shadows were, there'd be nothing there. And so Sofia, she began grabbing tighter and tighter onto Jorge's arm, and Jorge, who had been kind of joking about how this place was evil, was also now starting to feel a little bit spooked about what was going on. And so they began walking a little bit faster and faster in the direction of Anna's voice. And as Sofia and Jorge got closer and closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond began to get louder and louder and louder until Jorge and Sofia could barely hear Anna over the sound of these frogs. And then just like that, the frogs stopped, and all Sofia and Jorge could hear was the sound now of Anna crying. Now, Jorge and Sofia could not actually see Anna because of the fog, but they walked in the direction of her voice, and they ultimately found Anna crouched down with her back to them right in the spot where Enrique had previously been standing staring in that church window. And so Sophia and Jorge, they walked up to Anna and they reached down and they put their hands on her shoulder. And when Anna turned around, she was clutching Enrique's wicker basket containing all of his mushrooms. And with tears coming down Anna's eyes, she would say to her friends, "He's gone." Anna, Jorge, and Sophia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in La Musara. Remember, there's no visibility from the fog, and now it's getting dark, and so it's really hard to conduct a search for someone. And so after this hour was up, even though they had no idea where Enrique was or what happened to him, the friends decided that their best and really only move was to leave and go tell authorities. And when they did that, a massive search was launched all around La Musara for the next week. But despite this huge effort, nobody ever found any trace of Enrique. He just vanished, leaving behind that wicker basket that Anna had found. And so after this week of searching, the authorities finally called it off and told Anna that, most likely her husband must have wandered off and died somewhere, and at some point, hikers will likely discover his body. But Anna could not accept this conclusion, and so she continued to go back to La Musara to look for Enrique. And in January of 1992, so 3 months after Enrique had gone missing, Anna, Sophia, and Jorge returned to La Musara to do another one of these additional searches. And during the search, the friends were walking past the church, and they passed by that same window where Enrique had been standing looking inside, and also where his basket had been found by Anna. And the three friends, as they passed by, they happened to see into the church, and down on the main floor where the pews used to be and where the pulpit used to be, there were these 6 dark figures wearing robes standing in a circle, not appearing to be doing anything but just standing there. And immediately, Anna actually was really annoyed because she figured this must be a group of ghost hunters that were out here looking for something paranormal, because after Enrique went missing, his story made the news largely because he went missing in a town that's long been regarded as being haunted. And so because of his case, you had all these people coming to La Musara to go find ghosts or find whatever happened to Enrique. And so Anna, who was deeply offended by all these people who were coming out to La Musara to look for ghosts, because for Anna, this is not a game. Her husband really went missing here. So she goes right up to the window to tell these 6 people in robes off, get the hell out of here and have some respect. But when she went to the window and was about to yell in, one of the robed figures suddenly turned and looked up at Anna. And immediately Anna backed up because this clearly was not some ghost hunter, because the hooded figure had no face. It was just a dark hole looking back up at Anna. But even though there were no eyes, Anna could tell this thing, this entity, was staring right at her. But before Anna, Sophia, or Jorge could react to what they were seeing inside of this church, from behind them, they suddenly heard this unbelievably loud galloping sound, like all these horses were charging towards them. And at the same time, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder. And so Anna, Sophia, and Jorge turned around to see what was going on, kind of expecting to see, a cavalry approaching or something. But there was nothing. All they saw was the fog on the road. And so the 3 friends turned back around to look back into the church, and now these 6 hooded figures were gone. And so suddenly thinking that these figures had left the church and they were coming to get them, the 3 friends did not wait any longer. They turned and just sprinted out of La Musara. Enrique was never found. His wife, his friends, the authorities, they still have no idea what happened to him. There have also been several other people who have gone missing in La Musara, and they too have never been found. Just after midnight on August 31st, 2001, 36-year-old Dana Laskowski sat on her couch sipping a drink at her home in Puyallup, Washington, which is about 35 miles outside of Seattle. Dana had been enjoying a night at home by herself, but as she sat there on the couch, the silence in the house started to feel a bit unsettling. It just was not something she'd gotten used to yet. Dana was the mother of 9-year-old triplets, so the house was typically filled with a lot of noise. But tonight, the kids were 3 hours away, staying with their dad. Dana and her husband Stan had separated the previous year, and after the separation, Dana had moved several hours away to Puyallup, where some of her family lived. Dana and Stan had tried hard to effectively co-parent the triplets. She loved the idea.
She loved that the kids still had a good relationship with their father, but not having them around all the time had been a huge transition for Dana. Dana grabbed the remote off the coffee table and turned on the TV, just to have some background noise. She sipped her drink and then kind of laughed at herself. Spending a night on her own really should not be that big of a deal. It should be fun, it should be enjoyable. And plus, even though her triplets would be gone for a few more days still, Dana worked as a nanny for a couple in town, and she'd be able to spend time with their kids, who she loved too. And so Dana told herself to just relax and enjoy a stress-free night. Then she leaned back on the couch and tried to watch TV. But as she was doing that, she suddenly heard this noise coming from the back of the house. She put her drink down, turned off the TV, and then walked out of the room towards the back door. She expected to see her 17-year-old niece and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, standing in the hall, because Dana always kept her back door unlocked for these two teenage girls. Amanda and Emily both had strained relationships with their families, so Dana had become a kind of surrogate mother to both of them. She let them use her house to do laundry, take showers, or to just have a place they could come where they would feel taken care of. But when Dana reached the back of the house, she didn't see the girls standing in the hall. She walked to the back door and glanced outside onto the back porch, but she didn't see anybody there either. She figured she must be hearing things. Being home alone could do that after all. So she left the back door unlocked in case the girls did show up later, and then turned back around and headed back to the couch. Even though it was late, Dana suddenly thought about giving her niece a call, just to check in on her. The last time she'd seen Amanda and her friend Emily, they had been spending almost all their time with this group of teenage guys who called themselves the Park Rats, because they always hung around at the same public park. Dana tried to keep an open mind and not judge, but she couldn't help but worry about two young women spending time with a group of guys who did not seem to have any ambition in life. And she knew for a fact that some of the Park Rats had pretty serious drug problems. On top of that, Amanda and Emily were both relatively small girls, and Dana knew they really couldn't protect themselves if any of the guys ever tried to get physical with them. Dana sat down on the couch, still debating if she should call Amanda. However, before she could make up her mind, she heard something at the back door again. Then she heard footsteps coming down the hall. At 10:30 a.m. the following morning, a patrol officer from the Puyallup Police Department pulled up in front of Dana's house. He'd gotten a message from dispatch about an urgent 911 call that had come in that morning. A woman had called and said her children's nanny, Dana Laskowski, had not arrived at the house when she was supposed to. The woman and her husband had both called Dana, but couldn't get a hold of her. And this really worried them, because Dana would never not show up without calling and making sure the kids would be okay. So the woman had asked the police to please do a wellness check on Dana. The officer stepped out of his cruiser and glanced around the neighborhood. This was a pretty busy area of town, with lots of fast food restaurants and shops nearby, so the street could see plenty of traffic at night. The officer walked up to Dana's front door and knocked while calling out her name and also introducing himself. But after a few moments, he didn't get a response, and he also didn't hear any movement inside the house. And so eventually, the officer walked around to the side of the house and pressed his face against a window. However, the curtains inside the house made it difficult to see anything inside. So he walked around to the back of the house, and there he noticed the back door was cracked open. He slowly walked up the steps of the old wooden porch, approached the door, and then called out for Dana again through the crack. But there was still no response. The officer tensed up. He had no idea if this was an innocent mistake by Dana leaving the store open, or if maybe somebody had broken into her house. And if it was the latter, the intruder could still be inside. And so the officer unholstered his gun, pushed the door open, and stepped into the house. As he did this, he walked past an open door and glanced inside. It was a bedroom, and it looked like it had been ransacked. Dresser drawers were open and clothes had been thrown all over the floor, but he didn't see anybody in the room. And so the officer kept heading down the hallway, getting more and more tense as he moved. He eventually reached the front room and stepped inside. And there he found more pieces of clothing on the floor, but he still didn't see anybody. The officer reached for his radio, about to call in a potential burglary, when he looked over at the couch. And immediately, what he saw there told him he was dealing with something far worse than just a break-in. A little later that morning, veteran homicide detective Scott Bramhall of the Puyallup Police Department arrived at Dana's house. He saw a patrol officer standing out front, waiting for him. Bramhall could tell this officer was shaken up by what he'd found inside. Detective Bramhall talked to the officer and got as much information as he could, then he put on his gloves and stepped inside. Bramhall walked into the front room of the house and immediately saw what had upset the patrol officer. The dead body of a woman lay on the couch, with a blanket partially covering her legs, almost like she'd been keeping her feet warm. The patrol officer had found a photo ID during his search, and he had positively identified the woman as Dana Laskowski, the woman he had come to do the wellness check on. Detective Bramhall approached Dana's body and crouched down beside it. Right away, he saw specks of blood on her cheeks and mouth, as well as blood on the carpet by the couch. He also saw deep, dark bruises and ligature marks on Dana's throat. Bramhall looked around the room and saw a scarf on the floor not far from the couch. And his first thought was Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and that scarf could very well be the murder weapon. But the position Dana was lying in was by far the most shocking thing about this crime scene. Dana's head rested on one of her arms, but her other arm was bent at a strange angle behind her back, and her waist was twisted in an awkward position like her body was contorted. The result of all this was that even in death, Dana appeared like she was actively in some kind of physical struggle. Just then, the detective heard voices and footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned to see more police officers and a small group of forensic technicians walking into the room. Bramhall waved one of the forensic techs over, and the two of them began examining Dana's body together. The tech agreed that Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and the severity of the wounds on her throat indicated that whoever had killed her was pretty strong. Also, Detective Bramhall knew that in a lot of cases of strangulation, the victim fights back really aggressively, thrashing and fighting as much as they can, giving further credibility to the idea that Dana's killer really did have to be big and strong to be able to overpower her. After a few moments, Bramhall left the forensic tech and searched the rest of the house with a few other officers. He told a member of his team to get started on a background check for Dana, while other officers went out to speak with Dana's neighbors to see if any of them had seen or heard something strange that morning or the night before. As the detective made his way through Dana's house, it was clear the place had been ransacked. However, he noticed that some pretty obviously expensive items like a computer and other electronics had been left untouched. This could mean a couple of different things. Either someone had robbed Dana's house looking for something specific, like jewelry, or this entire scene had been staged to look like a robbery. Another thing that stood out to Bramhall was that even though Dana's body and the blood indicated a struggle, there was no sign of forced entry. The back door had been open and unlocked when the patrol officer had first arrived on the scene, and the front door had been locked and showed no signs of a break-in. So Bramhall wondered if Dana had let her killer inside, or if they had unlocked the back door with their own key. As Bramhall was searching the house, one of his team members came up to him. This officer told him that he'd only just started looking into Dana's background, but already he'd found something important. She and her husband Stan were recently separated, and Stan was not answering his phone. That night, after Detective Bramhall had spent hours at Dana's house, he got back to the police station, and he was already feeling antsy. Dana's husband, Stan, like any murder victim's spouse, would basically automatically be a major suspect under almost any circumstance. However, in the few hours since Bramhall had begun working this case, Stan had started to look like the perfect suspect. Stan had not responded to the multiple calls the Puyallup police had made throughout the day. And when Detective Bramhall had reached out to police in the town where Stan lived, they actually went by his house, and there had been no sign of Stan or the triplets. Now, Detective Bramhall did not want to jump to conclusions here. However, he couldn't ignore what might be going on here. A man killing his estranged wife so he could have sole custody of their kids was actually a fairly common thing. Still, Bramhall couldn't do anything until they actually tracked Stan down. So, the detective stayed in touch with the police in Stanstown, and he also contacted the Washington State Police to tell them to be on the lookout for Stan. In the meantime, Bramhall started to gather information on Dana's friends, family, and her employers. Now, he was already planning on interviewing everybody close to Dana, but if Stan didn't turn up soon, he hoped maybe one of them would be able to help police track him down. But the following morning, before Bramhall had met with anybody else, he got a phone call in his office. And as soon as he answered, he heard the voice of a man who sounded upset and a bit frightened. It was Dana's husband, Stan. Stan explained that he had just taken his kids camping and had been at a spot out in the woods that didn't get cell service. So when he'd left the campsite earlier that morning, he saw he had tons of voice messages from the police. And when he had called the cops back, he learned that his estranged wife had been murdered. And then after that, the police had connected him to Detective Bramhall. There was no question in Bramhall's mind that Stan was a major suspect. However, if Stan was innocent, Bramhall could not imagine a worse way to have gotten such horrific news. Bramhall told Stan they needed to talk right now in person, and so Bramhall said he would just drive over to Stan's house right now. Stan said okay, and so Detective Bramhall hung up and then told members of his team to begin looking into Dana's friends and family. Then Bramhall got in touch with the local police where Stan lived to say he was going there to interview him, and then he headed out. The 5-hour drive led Bramhall through the woods and hills of the Pacific Northwest, and as he drove, it hit Bramhall just how slow-going this trip really was. He wondered if Stan had gotten angry about having to make this drive just to see his kids. Maybe he'd gone to Dana's house and confronted her about it. If they'd gotten into a fight, Stan could have flown into a rage and killed her. Now, this was just a theory, but when Bramhall finally got to Stan's house along with a local officer and they met Stan at the front door, Bramhall's theory didn't seem too far-fetched. Because Stan was a big guy. He could have easily overpowered Dana. But more importantly, Bramhall noticed right away that Stan had scrape marks on both of his legs, a sign that perhaps he had a recent physical altercation with someone. Stan led Bramhall and the other officer into his house, and they all sat down together in the kitchen. Bramhall didn't waste any time. He asked Stan flat out if he and Dana had been arguing about their separation, and if that tension had led to any physical altercations. Stan immediately shook his head and said no. He didn't deny that he and Dana argued, and that being separated and trying to co-parent triplets could be stressful, but he said he and Dana had worked hard to help each other and to support each other, and to make their kids' lives as normal as possible. Bramhall immediately changed the subject, and asked Stan how he'd gotten those scrapes on his legs. Stan looked a little surprised by the question, but he said he'd gotten them while playing baseball. Bramhall jotted it down in his notebook, having no sense of whether or not he was actually getting the truth. Finally, Bramhall asked Stan if he'd be willing to submit a DNA sample. And at that, Stan's whole demeanor changed. He'd been cooperative the entire time, but now, he said there was no way he was going to provide DNA. He still didn't really know what was going on here, and he hadn't even talked to a lawyer. Bramhall knew he couldn't force Stan to give them a DNA sample, not yet at least. He also knew a lot of people, even innocent people, didn't like the idea of providing their DNA. So Bramhall stood up, said he'd check into Stan's camping trip alibi, and that he'd be in touch. Hours later, Bramhall made it back to the station, and he felt like nothing had really changed regarding Stan. Stan was still a major suspect, and since he hadn't provided a DNA sample, the police would just have to keep digging into his alibi and his background to see if they could find anything that directly connected him to the murder. However, within minutes of getting back to the police station, one of Bramhall's team members came into his office and told him he had a major new lead. Detective Bramhall was worn out from all that driving he'd just done, but he felt an instant rush when he heard this. He asked the officer what he'd found. The officer said he'd spoken to the couple who employed Dana as their nanny, and they said Dana had a stalker, a guy named William, and Dana had even said to her employers that if she ever turned up dead, William would be the one who had killed her. On the evening of September 2nd, 2 days after Dana's body had been found, Detective Bramhall sat inside of an interview room across the table from Dana's alleged stalker, William. It would turn out William had installed cabling at Dana's house a few months earlier, and since then, he'd been leaving notes and poems on Dana's front door, and he'd been seen lurking around her house a bunch of times by several of Dana's neighbors. Police also found a string of harassing messages from William on Dana's phone. And so all of that had been enough for Bramhall to secure a search warrant, and the search of William's house had led to a disturbing discovery. Inside the interview room, Detective Bramhall pulled out a notebook and put it on the table. Then he asked William if he recognized it. William lowered his head and then nodded. He said it was his personal journal. Bramhall flipped open the notebook and showed William what appeared to be a letter to an unnamed woman. And this letter was filled with all these violent things William wanted to do to her. Bramhall flipped to another page, which was another letter to this same unnamed woman, filled with even more anger and more threats of violence. And so Detective Bramhall said it looked to him like William had been obsessed with Dana, leaving her notes and poetry and spying on her at her house. And when Dana didn't reciprocate, he got angry and started fantasizing about hurting her and began writing about it in his journal. But as William heard this, he just shook his head and said, no, it's not like that at all. William said those letters were an exercise his therapist had told him to do, and they weren't even about Dana. He said he had written that stuff about a woman who'd broken his heart, but it was just to get out the anger and hurt that he felt. He would never actually do any of the stuff he had written. Bramhall sat there in silence for a minute, just looking at the man across the table. Like Dana's husband, William was easily big enough to have overpowered Dana. And even if William was telling the truth about the notebook, he clearly had some kind of unhealthy obsession with Dana. So Bramhall leaned in and told William there was a really easy way for him to clear his name and help the police figure out what happened to Dana. William could provide the police with his phone and a DNA sample. And William didn't hesitate. He said he would do whatever the police needed, anything that would show he did not hurt Dana. In the days following the interview with William, Detective Bramhall and his team met with more of Dana's friends and family. Bramhall had 2 solid suspects, Stan, the estranged husband, and William the stalker. But he still didn't have any clear evidence pointing to either of them. And most of the people he spoke to didn't provide much more information. But Bramhall eventually met with Dana's 17-year-old niece Amanda at her house, and she told him something that had the potential to turn his whole investigation on its head. Amanda told Bramhall that Dana was like a second mother to her and her best friend Emily. Dana let them come over whenever they wanted, and the house was like this great escape for them. Amanda said Dana even left her back door unlocked, just so they could come in whenever they wanted to. This was a huge piece of news for Bramhall. It now made sense how somebody could have gotten into Dana's house without actually having to break in. They just walked in the unlocked back door. But then Amanda said something else that seemed even bigger. She explained that she and Emily had become friends with a bunch of teenagers who called themselves the Park Rats. And Bramhall knew exactly who they were, and he knew some of them were bad news. More than a few Park Rats had ended up in jail for drugs and violent crimes. And so as soon as Bramhall heard this, he asked Amanda if any of the Park Rats knew that her aunt kept her back door unlocked. And Amanda nodded and said yes. She said she had actually brought a couple of the Park Rats to Dana's house to meet her, just because Amanda thought Dana was so good at taking care of people who didn't really have anybody else. And most of the Park Rats had very difficult home lives. Detective Bramhall left Amanda's house and laid out his next steps. So far, his case had seemed like a pretty straightforward case. Estranged husbands and stalkers were common suspects. But now, he and his team were going to have to track down and interrogate a local gang of teenagers. Finding the park rats didn't prove to be too difficult for Detective Bramhall. A few trips to the public park where they hung out, and meeting with a couple members of the group who were now in jail was really all it took. But getting the park rats to actually give him useful information turned out to be a lot harder. Most of them said they knew about Dana's murder, but all of them denied having anything to do with it. And since Bramhall didn't have any evidence connecting these teenagers to the scene, he couldn't just arrest them and try to force them to talk. And so, before long, a month had just flown by, and Bramhall still didn't have anything. And in that time, no new evidence surfaced that pointed to either Dana's husband Stan or the stalker William. And so Bramhall began to worry that maybe Dana's death had been the result of a random burglary gone wrong, and that the police were not even close to tracking down her killer. On October 4th, 2001, so 34 days after Dana's murder, her friends and family finally gathered for her funeral. Because of the ongoing investigation, police had waited longer than usual to release the body back to the family. But now, a funeral home in town was packed with people who had come to express how much they loved and missed Dana, and how much she had been there for them. Detective Bramhall and some members of his team attended the funeral, watching to see if anyone might do something that jumped out at them. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. It was just a group of people grieving the loss of a loved one. After the service was over, Bramhall secured the funeral memorial book, which had been signed by the people who had attended. Bramhall hoped that he could find someone in this book that could maybe offer his investigation a new lead. So Bramhall and his team brought the book back to the station and they went through it, and as they did, they saw some people, in addition to signing it, also left written notes. And one of these written notes totally floored Bramhall. After reading the notes several times, Bramhall felt confident he had just found a massive clue. Bramhall and his team quickly met with the person who had written this note, and what that person said led police right back to the park rats. Over the next several weeks, armed with new information from this memorial book, Detective Bramhall tracked down several of the park rats he'd already met with, and they were willing to cooperate. All of them still maintained they had nothing to do with Dana's murder, but they said there was somebody the police needed to talk to. It was someone they all knew, and who they called the Mutant. Bramhall thought the Mutant definitely sounded like a nickname a group of teenagers would come up with, like something out of a comic book. But the park rats said the Mutant was more like a name for a professional wrestler, because the Mutant was really strong and loved to wrestle. And like all professional wrestlers, the Mutant had a signature move: choking their opponent, twisting them at the waist, and bending their arm all the way behind their back. When Detective Bramhall heard about this signature wrestling move, immediately images of the bizarre position he'd found Dana's body in ran through his mind. And so, the detective and his team spent the next several days compiling background information, and then they brought the Mutant in for an interview. And by the end of that interview, Detective Bramhall knew who had killed Dana Laskowski. Based on information from the Mutant, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dana not long after midnight on August 31st, 2001. That night, the killer and their partner moved quietly through the darkness towards the back door of Dana's house. Once they got there, they opened it up, walked inside, and began walking down the hallway towards the front room. When they got there, they saw Dana standing by the couch, but before she could say anything, the killer demanded that Dana give them some money. Dana stayed calm and said she was sorry but didn't have any money, but the killer immediately snapped back and said Dana needed to hand over some cash right now. Dana repeated that she didn't have any money, and then she asked the killer and their partner to please just leave, but the killer wasn't having it. They walked over to Dana, they grabbed her and shouted that they wanted her money now. Dana tried to push the killer off, but the killer was too strong. Dana screamed, and this only set off the killer even more. They hit Dana in the face and then slammed her to the floor. Dana tried to get up off the floor, but the killer just leapt on top of her and rolled her over onto her stomach. Then the killer saw one of Dana's scarves laying on the arm of the couch, and they grabbed it. Then, before Dana could do anything, they wrapped that scarf around Dana's neck and began choking her. Dana kicked and flailed, but the killer fought off her attack, while the killer's partner just stood there, watching. The killer kept choking Dana with the scarf in one hand, and then with their other hand, they grabbed Dana's arm and they yanked it violently backwards, twisting her around at the waist. Dana tried to scream louder, but now she was gasping for air, and slowly Dana's eyes went wide and she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the floor. The killer let go of the scarf and Dana's arm, and they stood up. They stared down at Dana's body, and then over at their partner, who was still just standing there in a daze. Then the killer picked Dana up. The scarf fell to the floor as the killer laid Dana on the couch, still in her twisted position with her arm pinned behind her back. The killer then grabbed a folded-up blanket from the edge of the couch and covered Dana's feet and part of her legs with it, almost like they were tucking her in. But after the killer stepped away from the couch and kind of surveyed the scene, it was like they began to panic. They yelled at their partner that they needed to make this look like a robbery. The two of them quickly ran to Dana's bedroom and threw open all the drawers and littered the floor with clothing. They also carried some more clothes into the front room and dumped those on the floor as well. And then they ran out of the room, down the hall, and out the back door. The same back door that Dana had always left unlocked just for them, so they could always come to her house to escape their troubles at home. The people responsible for Dana's murder were Dana's own niece, Amanda, and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, who all of the park rats knew as the mutant. The two young women had gone to Dana's house to try to get Dana to give them some money, and when she refused, it was Emily, the mutant, who attacked and killed her. Emily had not been high on the suspect list because on the surface, she did not fit the profile of the killer. Police had assumed that the killer was a man who was bigger and stronger than Dana, and Emily was a small young woman who was only about 5'2". But it would turn out, despite her small size, Emily was extremely strong and loved to wrestle, hence how she got the nickname the Mutant. The note that Detective Bramhall saw in Dana's funeral memorial book that really stood out to him was written by Dana's niece, Amanda. And it read, "I'm sorry I wasn't a better niece for you. 34 days clean and sober. It's all for you." The funeral was held exactly 34 days after Dana's murder, suggesting Dana's murder prompted Amanda to go sober on that same day. Now, that in and of itself is not totally unreasonable that a death in the family would prompt a big life change. However, to Bramhall, as he was reading through the notes, that note just felt weirdly specific to reference her sobriety and the exact number of days inside of this memorial book when all the other notes were just far less specific. And so to him, something felt off about it. And so the detective followed up with Amanda and asked her about the note, and she would admit to him that she had been struggling with drug addiction. And so Bramhall wanted to know if her sudden sobriety was connected to Dana's murder, like the note implied. And Amanda would say yes, and over the course of this discussion, she would also just tell Bramhall that there was this drug dealer in the park rats who might have killed her aunt. However, when Bramhall met with that drug dealer and several other members of the park rats, they all pointed the finger at Emily, the mutant. Police searched Emily's house and found a piece of paper in her room. On it, she had written a list of goals she had, and one of those goals was to, quote, kill someone and get away with it. Emily eventually confessed to the murder, and Amanda admitted to being in the house during the murder. Dana's niece Amanda aided the police in prosecution, and so she was not charged with any crime. As for Emily, she would take a plea deal and would only serve about 5.5 years in prison. In late April 2013, 38-year-old Alejandra Soto was in her kitchen loading up a tray with Gatorade, a bowl of soup, a package of throat lozenges, and an inhaler. Upstairs, she could hear her 11-year-old daughter, Maggie, coughing in her bedroom. Her cough sounded bad, but it was a vast improvement compared to the past few days. Maggie had come down with a severe case of bronchitis, a condition that develops when the airway to the lungs becomes inflamed, causing a persistent cough. Alejandra had taken the week off from her demanding office job to take care of her daughter. She knew there'd be an avalanche of emails waiting for her when she got back to work, but her daughter's health came first, and she did not want to take any chances. Back when Maggie was a baby, she developed a severe case of pneumonia and almost died. Ever since, Alejandra had been incredibly cautious anytime Maggie developed any kind of respiratory illness. Thankfully, though, Maggie did seem to be recovering from this latest bout of bronchitis. She'd been on medication for the last 4 days and seemed to now have more energy and strength too. Alejandra hoped that in another few days, the bronchitis would disappear completely. As Alejandra grabbed the tray of supplies for her daughter off the kitchen counter, her phone lit up. It was more calls from clients that she was missing. She took a calming breath and reminded herself that in a few days she'd be back at work. Then she could put in some overtime to catch up, and everything would go back to normal. A few weeks later, in mid-May, Alejandra was setting the kitchen table for dinner while Maggie sat at the far end doing her homework. And at some point, Maggie just started coughing, and she was coughing so hard that her face turned beet red. Instinctively, Maggie reached for her inhaler, which she had been prescribed back in April for her bronchitis, and she breathed in the medication. And right away, her cough quieted down, and so she went back to work. But just minutes later, Maggie started coughing again. As Maggie took another puff from her inhaler, Alejandra rushed over and began rubbing her daughter's back, trying not to show how concerned she was. 2 weeks earlier, Alejandra had thought Maggie was getting better, and so she sent her to school. However, just a few days ago, Maggie had developed this dry cough. Now, Maggie had said she felt fine, but she was actually coughing more now than she had been before. Alejandra had taken her to the doctor's office for an exam, but the pediatrician just said to keep using her inhaler. The cough would clear up with time. Except, now it seemed like Maggie's cough was only getting worse. And so Alejandra sat down next to her daughter at the table and told her that it might be time for another doctor's visit. She'd see if the pediatrician could squeeze them in tomorrow, and then maybe afterwards they could grab some ice cream. Maggie said she liked the sound of that, and then she got up to help her mother bring dinner to the table. The following day, Alejandra sat in the pediatrician's office, ignoring the constant buzz of emails on her phone, while the doctor examined Maggie. He listened to her lungs with a stethoscope and told Maggie to breathe in deeply, and as she did, she exploded into a coughing fit. The pediatrician was sure that Maggie's bronchitis had cleared up. He told Alejandra that her daughter could be having some kind of allergic reaction, like hay fever, and so she wanted Alejandra to try over-the-counter allergy medications and see if maybe that alleviated the cough. On the way home, the mother and daughter grabbed some allergy medication from the pharmacy, along with some ice cream cones from the ice cream shop, as promised. Maggie took the allergy meds with some water in between licks of her cone, and within a few minutes, her cough seemed to be getting a bit better. Alejandra hoped that maybe now this would be the end of her coughing fits, and by tomorrow morning, they could go back to their usual routines. A month later, Alejandra sat inside of a dimly lit acupuncture spa that smelled like incense. Her daughter Maggie was lying on a massage table in the center of the room, looking completely calm as an acupuncturist pressed thin needles into her forehead. Alejandra tried not to flinch as she watched. She was very squeamish about needles and was impressed by how little they seemed to bother Maggie. In fact, this was the calmest Maggie had looked in weeks. She wasn't coughing at all. Generally, Maggie's cough had gotten drastically worse. Most of the time, she was coughing about every 4 seconds. She coughed all day long from the time she woke up to the moment she fell asleep. Somehow, Maggie could sleep through the night without coughing, but the rest of the time, she coughed incessantly. Maggie also said that her nose, throat, and stomach all hurt, which only made sense to Alejandra. She estimated that Maggie was coughing more than 10,000 times a day. Alejandra was genuinely scared for Maggie's health, and so at this point, she was basically willing to try anything to help her daughter. And since Western medicine did not seem to be solving Maggie's cough, Alejandra had decided to try something different: acupuncture. And so far, the acupuncture appeared to be working. Maggie's cough went away while the acupuncturist placed the needles around her body. Alejandra had no idea why this treatment seemed to work when so many others had failed, but she was not about to question it. After the acupuncturist had finished applying all the needles, they slowly began to take them back out again. She had Maggie breathe in deeply and sit upright as she worked. Alejandra felt relieved. They'd actually found a treatment that seemed to work. However, after all the needles were out and Maggie got off the table, she immediately began to cough. 2.5 months after that, Alejandra sat in a hospital examination room, watching a neurologist test her daughter's coordination skills. The doctor had Maggie mimic his movements as he balanced on each foot and tapped his nose and did a few dance moves. Maggie laughed in between coughs as she followed his choreography. It was clear the doctor was good at working with kids, and Alejandra was grateful for that, because it had been a long day. They'd been at the hospital since that morning, putting Maggie through a battery of physical exams, lab tests, and imaging scans. The doctors wanted to explore every possibility because at this point, Maggie was coughing an average of over 15,000 times a day. Alejandra did her best to put on a brave face in front of her daughter, but inside, she was a mess. For sure, she was terrified that something mysterious and potentially deadly was making her daughter ill, but Alejandra had to admit that she was also very stressed about all the work she'd been missing to make all of these doctor's appointments. Eventually, she would have to clock a lot of extra hours just to catch up, which meant more time away from Maggie. Now, she would do anything for her daughter, but physically and emotionally, she was reaching a breaking point. At some point, the neurologist told Maggie to have a seat, and then he bent over his clipboard to scribble a few notes. Alejandra held her breath, hoping the doctor would have some kind of news. But instead, he said there was nothing wrong with Maggie's coordination skills. However, the neurologist said he had a theory about what might be wrong with her. There was one last specialist he wanted Maggie to go see. A week later, Dr. Daniela Vega took notes while her new patient, Maggie, sat at the kid-sized table in her office, coughing away as she worked on a puzzle. Dr. Vega was a psychologist, and Maggie had been referred to her office by the neurologist at the hospital. Dr. Vega asked Maggie to describe her symptoms. Between coughs, Maggie told her that her nose and throat hurt, her stomach ached, and sometimes she got these tingly sensations in her thumbs and pinky finger. She said she coughed all day long, except for when she was sleeping or receiving acupuncture treatments. Dr. Vega made a few notes while Maggie continued to cough and work on her puzzle. But just a moment later, Maggie clearly stopped doing her puzzle and let out a huff like she was bored with the puzzle and with this appointment. Dr. Vega asked a few follow-up questions, but now Maggie's answers were short. There was an edge of annoyance in her voice. But to Dr. Vega, it made sense. Maggie had been to so many doctors at this point, she'd very likely answered all these questions dozens of times, yet still she was coughing. As Dr. Vega watched Maggie cough, she noticed she had a little routine. Maggie would scratch her nose, then squint, and then cough. Every few seconds, she'd scratch, squint, cough, over and over like clockwork. Dr. Vega made a note of it. Then the doctor put her clipboard down and asked Maggie what kind of music she listened to and what her friends were like at school. Maggie looked surprised, but she started telling Dr. Vega all about her classmates, her favorite subjects at school, and what she wanted to be when she grew up. Suddenly, Maggie was animated and engaged and seemed to love how intently Dr. Vega was listening to her. And while she was talking, Maggie barely coughed. Dr. Vega scribbled down a few more notes on her clipboard and thanked Maggie for sharing so much with her. Then she led Maggie back out to the waiting room where her mother was busy typing out emails on her phone. Alejandra stuffed her phone into her bag and rushed over to her daughter to ask how it went. Maggie very eagerly told her mother all about how she and Dr. Vega had talked about school and all the different things going on in her life and how fun the appointment was. And then after that, Dr. Vega asked them to wait for just a few minutes while she ducked into her office. She just wanted to reread Maggie's case file to make sure that the hunch she was forming was correct. Once she was back in her office, Dr. Vega pulled up Maggie's medical history. Specifically, she wanted to read the section about Maggie's case of pneumonia when she was only 18 months old. Dr. Vega suspected that there was nothing physically wrong with Maggie. Rather, her persistent cough was actually a vocal tic, a completely psychological phenomenon. The conversation she had just had with Maggie about her friends and about school and what she wanted to be when she grew up tipped off the psychologist. When Maggie was talking about things that interested her, she coughed less. The cough also disappeared completely when she slept, which would not necessarily happen if this cough was caused by an infection. But, perhaps most importantly, Maggie didn't seem worried about her cough or about trying to get better. It was almost like she subconsciously knew that she wasn't actually really sick. Dr. Vega suspected that part of what brought on this tic was Maggie's severe case of pneumonia when she was a toddler. When she was ill, her mother, Alejandra, had slowed down and paid way more attention to her. And then ever since, anytime Maggie had a cough or flu-like symptoms, once again, her mother would be extra attentive. Dr. Vega was pretty sure that subconsciously, Maggie was coughing to get attention from her mother, who seemed to be constantly overloaded with her work. And so while Maggie's cough was actually real in the sense that she really did feel this need to cough, the underlying reason for it was not physical. It was all in her head. Once Dr. Vega delivered this diagnosis, Maggie was treated with a low dose of an antipsychotic, as well as daily talk therapy that included breathing and muscle control exercises. After only a week of treatment, Maggie's cough rate decreased from almost 1,000 coughs an hour to just about 40. Then her doctors decided to try her on a different antipsychotic, and after only 12 days on it, Maggie stopped coughing altogether. And now here's our second story called The Putrid Smell. In August 1986, on the first day of first grade, 6-year-old Eloise Taylor walked into her brand new elementary school. She felt excited to be around all these people her own age. She'd been looking forward to meeting her classmates all summer and couldn't wait to make friends. She got in line with all the other kids in her class and followed her new teacher, Miss Brody, down the hall to their classroom. Miss Brody gave Eloise the desk right at the front of the room, and Eloise was determined to be her best student. She began unpacking her school supplies, then sat at her desk and turned around to say hello to the girl right behind her. But when she did, that girl just wrinkled her nose and made a face, like Eloise had done something wrong. She turned her back to Eloise and started whispering to other classmates. Eloise was confused, but she didn't have time to dwell on it, because Miss Brody called for attention and began passing out a worksheet. First day of school had officially begun. Eloise listened intently as Miss Brody began her lesson, and she figured Miss Brody must have noticed how well she was paying attention because during the lesson, Miss Brody kept pausing to look over at Eloise. Eloise sat up a little straighter, confident she was making a great first impression. And so she wasn't surprised when Miss Brody tapped her on the shoulder right after lunch and asked her to join her in the hallway. She figured she was going to tell her what a good job she was doing. But once they were in the hallway, Miss Brody crouched down and asked her if she had taken a bath the night before. Eloise was confused, but nodded and said yes. Miss Brody just pursed her lips, like she wasn't sure if Eloise was actually telling her the truth. She asked Eloise a few more questions about her hygiene, like if she bathed every night, how many times a day she brushed her teeth, that sort of thing. Eloise did her best to answer, feeling more and more like she was in trouble for something, except she couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. As soon as they went back into the classroom, Miss Brody announced that they were all going to move desks. She'd made a new seating chart during lunch. Eloise dutifully emptied out her desk and waited as Miss Brody gave out the new seating assignments. She called Eloise last, and she put her all the way in the back corner of the classroom, right by an open window. Eloise felt like the whole class was staring at her as she shoved her books into her new desk. As soon as she sat down, the kid right in front of her began inching his desk forward, like he was trying to put space between them. Eloise didn't understand why nobody in her class wanted to be near her, so for the rest of the day, she just kept to herself. When the final bell rang at 2 p.m., Eloise shoved her homework into her backpack as her classmates began filing out of the class. Some of the boys passed by her desk on their way out the door, and each one of them whispered "fish" as they walked by. Eloise didn't really know what they meant, but her face still went red hot. She tried to linger behind the rest of the class as they all walked to the parking lot to wait for their parents, But one of the girls turned around and told Eloise out loud that she smelled like manure. Then a couple of boys started chanting dead fish, over and over again. Eloise immediately burst into tears. Luckily, she saw her dad's car right at the front of the pickup line, and so she sprinted right over to it. She climbed into the passenger seat and told her dad what happened, that her new classmates hated her. Her dad let out a long, apologetic sigh, almost like he'd been expecting this. Then he told Eloise that for some reason, ever since she was little, she would occasionally start smelling like fish. Her doctors had no idea why this was happening. It was just something she was born with. Eloise was stunned. She wanted to know why her parents had never told her about this. But her dad didn't have a good answer. He just said that they didn't want her to worry about it before it became a problem. Eloise was quiet for the rest of the ride home. She couldn't smell this fish odor herself. But clearly, it was strong enough to stink up her entire classroom. And now she had no idea how she was going to go back to school and face the same ridicule every day. Over the next several years, Eloise tried to keep to herself, but some of her classmates still bullied her. And when she entered middle school, the bullying only got worse. One afternoon in 6th grade, Eloise was headed to class when a couple of 8th graders cornered her in the cafeteria. They threw tuna fish sandwiches at her and laughed about how bad she smelled. Their taunting drew a crowd, and suddenly the whole hallway seemed to be laughing at her. Eloise tried hard not to cry, but holding back the tears took so much concentration that she didn't have the energy to fight back or walk away. She just stood there, taking the ridicule, until the school librarian stepped in and told everyone to go to class. The librarian shielded Eloise until the hallway cleared out. Then she invited her to clean up in the bathroom and come have lunch in the library. Eloise nodded, her whole body shaking with adrenaline. She couldn't take the bullying anymore. She had to figure out what was causing the fish odor and find a way to make it stop. From that day on, Eloise ate lunch in the library. Though there were no computers in the school at the time, the librarian helped Eloise comb through the school's collection of encyclopedias and other textbooks to try to find a cure. However, 2 years later, by the time Eloise graduated 8th grade, she hadn't found anything. And doctors weren't able to help either. Nobody was able to figure out why Eloise smelled so bad. Eight years later, around 2003, Eloise sat down at her workstation at the local bank. She was newly graduated from college and working on her master's degree in education. Her dream was to become a teacher, but in the meantime, she had gotten a job as a bank teller. Eloise sprayed herself with the perfume she kept in her bottom drawer, then logged into her computer. She quickly got so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice her supervisor walking up to her desk. He tapped on her shoulder and told her to pack up her things and follow him. He had some new responsibilities for her. Eloise smiled, but she had a sinking feeling in her stomach. She followed her supervisor to the very back of the bank, to an isolated room with a big window. He told her she was going to be the drive-through bank teller from now on. Eloise knew the real reason she had been moved here. She felt defeated. This was like 1st grade all over again when she got moved to the back of the class on day 1. A moment later, she could hear the soft hiss of a Lysol spray bottle down the hallway, and she knew that some of her colleagues must be spraying down her old workstation with air freshener. Eloise knew her fishy odor would eventually become a problem at work, even though she showered multiple times a day and constantly coated herself with perfume. The odor was just too overpowering. She couldn't blame her coworkers for not wanting to be around her. Eloise's odor was the reason she didn't have any friends, and it made her feel like she was a burden to her family. She didn't let herself get close to anyone. She'd tried dating someone recently who promised he was okay with her smell, but she worried that he'd eventually get sick of it, so she actually ended things before he could. And now, she sat on the metal stool in front of the bank's drive-through window and tried not to take it personally when her supervisor shut the door on his way out. She knew there was no escaping her odor, but she was beginning to realize what that truly meant for the rest of her life. If she didn't find a way to mask it or control it, this would be her future. Complete isolation as she watched the world pass her by. The following year, in the fall of 2004, Eloise moved through her new classroom, opening up windows and setting up a few strategically placed fans. A few months earlier, Eloise had finally finished her master's in education and got a job teaching middle school. She hoped that, as a teacher, she could make life better for any kids who faced bullying, like she had all through school. She was still nervous about her odor, but she had a plan. If the windows stayed open, and she could keep air blowing at her, nobody would notice the fish smell. This would work, she thought. It had to. Soon, her class filed in, and she began with the day's lesson. She kept checking over her shoulder, but nobody was making a face or sniffing the air. Everyone was bent over their desks, hard at work. She couldn't help but feel excited. It was working. Nobody could smell her. The following morning, Eloise doused herself in perfume, then got to school early to spray the classroom with air freshener and turn on the fans. And that day, once again, nobody mentioned a fish smell. By the time the lunch bell rang, she was overjoyed. Finally, after more than 2 decades of dealing with her odor, she'd found a way to mask it. Once Eloise's classroom had cleared out, she walked around with the Lysol can again, and then headed over to the teacher's lounge. It was just across the hall from the cafeteria, so the teachers could usually hear their students talking while they waited in line for lunch. Eloise sat down at a table near the door and began to unpack her lunch bag. And as she did, she heard a few students talking about their summer breaks and their new classmates. Then, she heard a student say he had the new teacher, Miss Fishy. The students around him laughed and said they knew exactly what he was talking about. That afternoon, Eloise couldn't focus on her lesson. She kept stumbling over her words or forgetting what she was writing on the chalkboard. All she could think about was whether she was filling the classroom with that pungent, reeking smell. Every noise a student made felt like a stifled laugh at her expense. She was so stressed out that when she finally got into her car after school, she just broke down and cried. Over the years, Eloise had seen countless specialists about her condition, and she'd continued to do her own research, even while she was studying all the time for her master's degree. But nothing helped. She felt trapped and utterly defeated. She'd spent most of her childhood crying on the way home from school, and now it appeared like she might spend the rest of her career the same way too. For the rest of the week, Eloise was so preoccupied by her smell that she could barely teach. Then it got even worse on Friday when her fish odor stank up the entire auditorium during a school assembly. She was a laughingstock and was so discouraged that she just couldn't continue like this. Before she left school on Friday afternoon, she headed to the principal's office and resigned. A month later, Eloise sat on her couch feeling down. A random sitcom rerun was playing on her television, but she wasn't paying any attention to it. She was on her computer, scrolling mindlessly through a website with comedy videos. Eloise hadn't used the internet very much until she started her master's program, since the internet was still a newer technology. But now she was making up for lost time. Lately, she would spend hours on different comedy sites, trying to distract herself from what a freak she felt like. For the past few weeks, Eloise had been thinking more and more about suicide. She had no friends, she didn't feel like she had a future. She couldn't even bring herself to look for another job. She was at rock bottom. She clicked on another comedy video, wishing she were tired enough to go to sleep. And that's when she saw an advertisement at the bottom of a webpage for a site called Ask Jeeves, which was one of the leading search engines in the early days of the internet. You could ask a digital butler named Jeeves any question, and he would comb the internet for answers. Eloise was intrigued. She clicked on the banner and then typed into the search bar, "fishy body odor." After hitting return, she didn't expect much. But then, a couple of links began popping up. Eloise bolted upright as she clicked on the top result. It brought her to a website that described an extremely rare condition called trimethylamuria, or TMAU for short, although apparently it was more commonly known as fish odor syndrome. It's a metabolic disorder where the body can't break down a smelly chemical called trimethylamine. The body produces the chemical when a person eats certain foods like bread, beans, eggs, and of course fish. And because people like Eloise can't break down this chemical, it builds up in their system and seeps into their lungs, saliva, sweat, and other bodily fluids, causing a pungent smell that comes from inside. When Eloise discovered this, there were only 600 documented cases of the syndrome in the entire world, and so Eloise became number 601. After some more searching, Eloise found an online community of people living with this rare condition. They helped her learn how to manage her odor by changing her diet and taking daily supplements like chlorophyll, which may help reduce inflammation in the body. Eloise also met a doctor who understood fish odor syndrome, and they helped her find the best perfumes and deodorants to help mask the smell. And surprisingly, these steps she was taking as a result of this community worked. People stopped making fun of Eloise, and slowly she became confident enough to have friends and go out socially. After nearly 30 years of struggling with this putrid smell, Eloise found a way to lead a mostly normal life. She ultimately went back to teaching, determined to create a special curriculum for students who were different in any way, to make sure that nobody suffered the same kind of ridicule that she did.
On the evening of March 25th, 2017, a 25-year-old farmer named Akbar Solabiro was harvesting palm fruit at the local oil palm grove near his tiny village in Indonesia. Now, the way Akbar would do this is he would use this long curved pole and he would prod at the bright red fruit in the tree, knocking it to the ground, and then he would gather it up, put it in his cart, and wheel it back home to be sold for palm oil. Now, on this night, Akbar was actually working later than usual because his wife and kids were out of town for a couple of days visiting family, and so there was no real reason to head back home because the house was empty. But Akbar was actually just fine with that because there was tons of ripe fruit, and so staying late would be quite profitable. But after a while, when the sun had finally set and it was getting difficult to actually even see the fruit in the tree, Akbar knew he really needed to leave soon because this area at night was actually not safe. And so Akbar gathered up the remainder of his fruit on the ground, he put his pole in the cart as well, and he began quickly making his way back home. Later that evening, one of Akbar's neighbors was asleep in their bed inside of their home when they woke up suddenly to the sound of something out in the jungle, not far from where Akbar had been harvesting palm fruit. And so this neighbor, when they sat up, they couldn't really tell what the sound was. It almost sounded like a stifled scream or maybe some animal that was fighting with another animal. But as the neighbors sat there straining their ears to try to hear it again, they didn't. All they heard was normal sounds coming from the outside. And so the neighbor decided that the sound they heard must have been a cat or maybe a monkey. And, whatever it was, it couldn't have been a big deal. And so this neighbor went back to sleep. The following evening, so 24 hours later, another one of Akbar's neighbors walked outside of their home to begin the walk over to the jungle to harvest palm fruit. And when they went outside, normally around this time, Akbar would be coming outside as well, because these two often went to the grove together. But, this neighbor is looking and Akbar's not outside, and he looks up at Akbar's house and it's dark and quiet. And so this neighbor's thinking to themselves, where is Akbar? I know he worked late last night. I didn't hear him come in. And come to think of it, I haven't seen him all day. And now, of course, I'm not seeing him as well. And so this neighbor, feeling concerned about Akbar, walked over and knocked on his door, but nobody answered. And so really starting to think that something could be wrong with Akbar, this neighbor went to Akbar's uncle's house. And when Akbar's uncle came to the door, this neighbor explained what was going on and they're concerned that, something could have happened to Akbar. And so the uncle and this neighbor would go back over to Akbar's home and they would actually try the door. It was locked. They looked inside the windows and it looked like no one was in there. And they also noticed that where Akbar typically kept his cart that he would transport his fruit in, it wasn't there either, which made them think, Akbar must still be out somewhere with this cart because this cart is very important to him. And so ultimately, the uncle, after seeing the state of his nephew's home, he agreed with this neighbor that, something was wrong here. And if they wanted to find Akbar, they really needed to get together a search party right now and go looking for him. So the uncle contacted the leaders of the village, and they in turn rounded up all the able-bodied men in the village, and they all got together with headlamps and flashlights and machetes and knives, and then all together they began walking away from the village into the jungle in the direction of this palm grove, which was the place that Akbar had been last. And so this big group of men, they get inside the jungle and they begin walking along this path, which was the most likely path that Akbar would have taken to go to the palm grove grove and also to return from the palm grove. And as they're walking, the sun is starting to set, it's getting dark, and the animals in the jungle, they're all making noises and kind of yelling at this group as they're moving through. And this group, they're shining their light around looking for any sign of Akbar, but there wasn't any. They were calling his name out, there was no response. And then at some point, as they got closer to the palm grove, they noticed there were a couple of bright red fruits, palm fruits, that had clearly been recently harvested that were scattered on the trail. And so the group began to fan out in this area, thinking that, oh my goodness, Akbar must be somewhere nearby. Maybe there was some sort of accident and he's fallen somewhere, or just something's happened to him, but he's got to be in this area. And so the group began fanning out off the trail, kind of hacking their way through all the underbrush. And then suddenly, one of the men, after he hacked through a particularly dense stretch of the jungle, he looked down and saw something and began to scream, and he raised his machete and began running forward. As far as we can tell, this is what happened to Akbar. The previous night, after Akbar had decided, it wasn't safe to be in the jungle at night, he needed to leave, and so he gathered up all of his things and he began walking along that path where the search party would find all that fruit scattered on the trail. And so he's walking along this path, and he thinks he's alone, he thinks he's okay, but in reality, he wasn't. He was being watched and followed very closely from something up in the trees. And so as Akbar moved along, this thing was kind of trailing him and seeing what he was going to do. And then at some point, this thing up in the trees began moving its way down closer and closer to Akbar. It was a 23-foot-long reticulated python. It was a massive snake. And this snake came down and launched an attack on Akbar, grabbing the back of his neck with its powerful jaws. And as soon as the snake clamped down on Akbar's neck, he let out a stifled scream, which was the scream that had woken up that other neighbor who sat up in bed wondering what that was. That was Akbar screaming out. But that was the only sound Akbar could make, because immediately the snake wrapped itself all around Akbar and squeezed him tight. And after crushing Akbar, breaking almost every bone in his body, the snake relaxed and then slithered off of Akbar. And so Akbar fell to the ground and was either dead or very close to death. And at this point, the snake opened up its jaws and positioned itself right in front of Akbar's head. And then it began kind of slithering itself forward, consuming Akbar head first. And the way pythons do this is they don't really chew on their victim. Instead, they kind of put their mouth over the top of whatever they're going to consume, and they kind of undulate and walk their bodies forward, driving the victim deeper and deeper into their body until they are completely consumed. And so the next night, when one of the members of the search party had gone off the trail and began hacking away and then saw something and charged after it with his machete, what he was seeing was the python, who very clearly had a person inside of its stomach. You could see the outline of the person. And so this search party member ran forward and hacked the snake, opened it up, and there was Akbar fully dressed and deceased inside of the snake. On the night of February 19th, 2022, a 41-year-old woman named Paula Ruiz was working the reception desk at a 4-star hotel in southern Mexico. It had been a long Saturday night with lots of tourists checking in and lots of confused tourists asking for directions or clarifications about things in the area. But it was finally nearing 11 p.m., which was the end of Paula's shift, and also things had calmed down near the reception desk. There wasn't much going on. And so Paula took a moment and grabbed her phone and checked it. And she saw there was a text message from her 19-year-old son saying he would be picking her up after work on his motorbike. And then just a couple of minutes later, Miguel, her son, actually walked in the front door of the hotel. He waved to his mom and said, hey, I parked my motorbike just down the street. Whenever you're ready, we can leave. And so Paula, she was very happy to see her son. She walked over, she gave him a kiss and a hug, and then she began gathering her things. Paula loved the fact that her son was totally comfortable driving around town with his mom on the back of his motorcycle. Other teenagers might think that was awkward, but not Miguel. But Paula knew her son absolutely loved his motorbike and basically was always looking for an excuse to ride it. And so very likely that was why he was so eager to give his mom a ride home. And so finally, after Paula had gathered up her things and said goodbye to her coworkers, she and her son walked out the front doors of the hotel, and they began walking down the road and around the corner to where Miguel always parked his bike whenever he picked his mom up from work. However, when they turned the corner and looked at the spot where Miguel said he had parked, his bike wasn't there. Now, at first, Paula asked Miguel, are you sure you parked it here? Maybe did you park it farther down the road? But Miguel said, no, this is where I always park. I definitely parked it right here. And so Miguel became convinced that someone must have stolen his bike. That was the only explanation that made sense. But Miguel still had the keys to his motorcycle, which meant whoever had stolen it had likely hotwired it. And since that takes quite a bit of time to pull off components of the bike and kind of fiddle around with the wires to make it start, Miguel was thinking that, okay, maybe they're still in the area trying to hotwire it. Let's go look for them and get the bike back. Now, the city in southern Mexico where Paula and Miguel lived was called San Cristobal de las Casas, and it was a totally beautiful place surrounded by all these hills, but it was also a very dangerous place, full of lots of street crime and violence and gangs that used the area as a hotspot for drug trafficking. And so this is not really a good place to be walking around at night, let alone trying to chase down some bike thief. But Paula and Miguel, they knew this. They lived there. They understood the risks. And Paula especially, she knew that Miguel was going to go looking for this bike because he loved that bike. And so Paula didn't hesitate and said, okay, Miguel, let's go looking. And she figured at a minimum, she could take a video or a picture of the thief if they found them with the bike, and then they could give that to police, and then maybe they could track the person down if Miguel and Paula couldn't get the bike back that night. And so Paula and Miguel began running down these side streets looking all over the place for Miguel's bike. And you gotta picture some narrow alleyways with barely any lighting. I mean, this is a sketchy area. And so they're running around, and then finally they turn a corner and Miguel sees up ahead his distinctive yellow motorbike, and he sees some stranger is pushing it along. Clearly this person is pushing it away so they can hotwire it. And so Miguel and Paula begin charging down the road, and Miguel actually gets in front of this guy and stops him, and Miguel starts screaming at the guy to give him his bike back. And then Paula, she joins her son and she starts screaming at him as well and taking videos and pictures. And then as this is happening, another man on a motorbike came flying up behind Paula and Miguel. And as they did, Paula and Miguel heard the sound of the engine and they turned around, and all Paula saw was this young man holding a gun, aiming it at her son, Miguel, right at his chest. And so her motherly instincts kicked in and she leapt in front of her son, and then not knowing what else to do, she raised her phone and took a picture. And then seconds later, there was a loud bang, and then suddenly this guy who had been trying to steal Miguel's bike gave it up. He dropped the bike, he took off running down the road, and the gunman, he too turned his bike around and sped off down the road, leaving Miguel and Paula in the alleyway. Except Paula was on the ground because a second after she took that photo, the gunman had shot her in the chest. Paula would be taken to the hospital, but she would die the following morning, orphaning Miguel and his 3 siblings. However, the photo that Paula took of her killer seconds before he killed her was such a high-quality photo showing his face that just 2 days after her murder, police were able to use that photo to find the killer as well as his accomplice, and they were both arrested. On the morning of February 25th, 2015, in a little house in the city of Cape Town in South Africa, a 17-year-old girl named Mishe Solomon was packing up her homework in between bites of her breakfast. And as she did this, her mother, Lavana, walked into the kitchen with a big smile on her face, and she was holding up this beautiful red flowing dress, and immediately Mishe knew what it was. Her mom had been making this dress by hand over the past couple of days. It was for a big school dance that was coming up, and she saw that it was now done. And so Mishe, she put down her breakfast and her homework, and she rushed over to her mom, and she admired this gorgeous dress and thanked her mom for all the hard work and said it's absolutely perfect. And then from somewhere behind Misha, her father, who was still sitting at the table, kind of grunted out, "Hey, isn't that dress a little bit revealing?" And Misha and her mom kind of just rolled their eyes because they knew Misha's dad just loved his daughter and was very, very protective of her. And so basically anything she wore that wasn't full coverage was too revealing. And so Misha, after rolling her eyes, walked over to her dad. She gave him a big hug and a kiss. And she said, "Dad, don't worry about it. It's just fine." And so after that, Misha went back to her breakfast. She finished eating, she packed up her stuff, and then she gave her mom and her dad another hug and a kiss and said goodbye. And then she headed out the front door out to the road where her aunt was waiting in her car. As Misha's aunt drove her to school, like she did almost every single morning, Misha began to notice her aunt was acting kind of strange and constantly looking behind her and looking in her rearview mirror. And finally, Misha said to her aunt, "What's going on? What are you looking at back there?" And Misha's aunt would say, "I know this sounds crazy, but I'm pretty sure there's a white car that's following me. And in fact, over the past couple of days, I've seen what I think is this same white car following us anytime I'm driving you to school." And so Misha just turned around in her seat and looked out the back window, and she saw there were dozens of white cars on the road, so it was pretty difficult to tell which one her aunt was talking about. But as she's looking, none of the cars seemed suspicious. And so Misha turned back around and told her aunt, "I think you're just being paranoid. Nobody's following us. There's no reason to follow us." A few minutes later, Misha's aunt pulled up alongside the front of the school, and Misha said goodbye to her aunt. She thanked her, she hopped outside, and she rushed into the school. And then Misha made her way up to the hallway where her first class was, and as she was walking down the hallway, her best friend, Cassidy Nurse, was walking up the hallway in her direction. And so right away, Misha sees Cassidy, and she waves and smiles and begins walking towards her. But Cassidy gave Misha this kind of weird, lukewarm smile, and then quickly looked away from Misha, and then Cassidy turned and bolted into the nearest classroom. And so Misha just came to a stop and just looked at the doorway where her best friend has disappeared, and she starts thinking to herself, what's going on? Why did she do that? That was so cold. And then Misha began to think about the fact that actually, over the past couple of days, Cassidy had been acting really strange. It was like she was trying to avoid Misha, but Misha had no idea why. It wasn't like they were fighting. Normally, Misha and Cassidy were totally inseparable. They had met earlier that school year, and even though they were actually kind of far apart in age, Cassidy was in 8th grade and Misha was in 12th grade, it was like it didn't matter. It was like right away when they met each other, they had this special bond where they just had to be around each other all the time. They shared everything with each other. And certainly anytime they saw each other in the hallway, they would stop to chat or even go into a nearby bathroom and do each other's hair and makeup and share any gossip they had recently heard. So for Cassidy to act like this was just totally uncharacteristic, and it really upset Misha. But just then, the bell rang in the school, so Misha knew at this point she was now late for her class, and so she had to forget about whatever was going on with Cassidy, and Misha just hustled down the hallway and went into her classroom. And so Misha, she takes her seat at her desk, she puts her stuff down, and she's getting ready to listen to the teacher, when suddenly the principal comes in without even knocking, and without even saying anything to Misha's teacher, the principal walks right up to Misha and says, "I need you to come with me." And right away, Misha's classmates, all who saw this, they begin oohing and awing as if Misha is in huge trouble. But Misha's thinking to herself, I didn't do anything. I have no idea what this is about. And so she kind of smiled like it was no big deal. She picked up her stuff and she followed the principal out into the hallway. But as Misha followed the principal down the hallway towards the principal's office, Misha's smile faded and she began to wonder, what is this about? What's going on? And then finally, they got to the principal's office. The principal opened up the door. Misha went in first, and the principal trailed behind her and shut the door behind them. When Misha looked into the principal's office, she saw there were already 2 people inside who she didn't recognize. It was 2 women who were very serious looking, who were sitting on the side of the room. And as soon as Misha walked in, the 2 women, without introducing themselves, just told Misha to come over and take a seat next to them. And Misha, instead of doing that, just paused and looked at the women and said, "What's going on?" And at this, the 2 women kind of looked at each other, and then one of the women piped up and said, "Misha, we're here because the police sent us. And they sent us because of a photo that you and your very close friend Cassidy took." But before Misha could ask any questions like, what photo are you talking about and really what's going on here, these two women would explain the whole situation to Misha. And basically what they did is they told her this long, very convoluted story that involved Misha, it involved Cassidy, it involved this photo. And by the end of this story, this explainer story, Misha had taken a seat and put her hand over her mouth in utter disbelief. And then when the women were done explaining everything, Misha had a million questions, but it was like she was so overwhelmed with what she was just told that she just continued to sit there with her hand over her mouth, totally silent. And then finally, Misha did break the silence by saying, "Can I please just call my parents?" And at this, the social workers said, "No, you can't. And in fact, the police are already at your parents' house. They're talking to your parents right now. And so you can't talk to them and you can't even go home. In fact, you have to come with us for tonight." And then the two women got up and they made their way out of the principal's office and they said, "Come on, Misha, you have to come with us." And so Misha stood up and she's totally flabbergasted. She really is like, how is this real life? And the principal at this point walked over and gave Misha a hug. And it was like suddenly the floodgates opened and Misha just began sobbing hysterically. And as she did, the social workers just stood there waiting patiently. And then as soon as it seemed like Misha was done crying, they said, "Come on, you really need to come with us." And so Misha, she let go of the principal and she followed the two women out of the school out to one of their cars. And once they got in the car, the two women explained to Misha that they were going to take her to a safe house for the night. But before they went to the safe house, they would need to make a quick pit stop at a local medical clinic. And so Misha, who at this point is not even asking questions, just said, "Okay." And so the women, they drove to the medical clinic. They were inside for just a matter of minutes. When they came back out again, they drove the rest of the way to the safe house. And when they got to the safe house, it just looked like a normal house on the outside. But on the inside, when the two women were leading Misha through and showing her where everything was, the kitchen, the bathroom, her bedroom, all Misha saw was all these other kids who were staying there who were orphaned and abandoned. And it started to give Misha a panic attack. And she asked the women again, "Can I please call my parents?" And they said, "No, you really can't." But one of the two social workers could tell that Misha, she's having a breakdown. This is the worst day of her life, very likely. And so one of the two women actually offered to Misha to come home with her and stay at her house instead of the safe house. And Misha agreed. And so that social worker and Misha, they would leave together, they would get into that woman's car, and they would drive to her house. And then the social worker told Misha that unfortunately now it was just a waiting game. They needed to wait for the police to get back in touch with them with more information. That night, as Misha lay in this woman's guest bedroom, looking up at the ceiling, wondering how the heck this had become her life, she began to think about the photo that her and Cassidy had took that had kind of started this whole horrible thing. And so Misha began to think about the day they took this picture, and all she remembered was that she and Cassidy were just kind of goofing around and smiling and making funny faces and just taking photos as they went. She certainly didn't think that one of those pictures they took would totally change her life. The following morning, when Misha woke up, the social worker brought her to their office, the social worker's office, and there they met with the other woman who had first met Misha in the principal's office, and the three of them just sat in the office, not talking much, eating chicken wings and other snacks, just literally waiting for police to call them. And finally, they would call. And when they did, one of the social workers answered the phone, and as she listened to what she was being told, she began to frown, and by the time she hung up, she was crying. The news from the police was the news Misha had been afraid of ever since sitting in the principal's office the day before and hearing this whole crazy story about her and Cassidy and this photo. The special pit stop that Misha and the social workers made at the medical clinic the day before on the way to the safe house was so that Misha could get a DNA test. And now the police were calling back with the results of the test. And what the results showed was Misha Solomon was not actually Misha Solomon. Her real name was Zephany Nurse. 17 years earlier, Zephany Nurse had been stolen out of her crib at the hospital in Cape Town, and despite a massive manhunt for her, she was never found. And so this was a huge, famous case in Cape Town, and most people assumed it would never be solved. But Misha's DNA had done just that. It proved that Misha's parents, who had loved her and raised her since she was a baby, were not actually her parents. Her mother, Lavana, was actually her kidnapper. and now she was under arrest. But even though this revelation was incredibly shocking and upsetting for Misha, it was not nearly as shocking as learning the identity of her real biological parents. The social workers took Misha from their office to the police station, where they told Misha her real biological parents were waiting to meet her. And so once they went inside the police station, Misha gripped onto the social worker's arm tightly. She was incredibly nervous, and she was led down a hallway to a door that was shut. And then finally, when Misha was ready, she pushed the door open, and her real parents, who were sitting right in front of her, they stood up and they ran towards her crying. But Misha just stood there, stunned and silent, staring at them. Because these people, they were not strangers to her. She knew them extremely well. They were the parents of her best friend in the world, Cassidy Nurse. Which meant Misha, aka Zephany Nurse, was Cassidy's sister. Months earlier, when Misha and Cassidy first met each other, the reason they hit it off so quickly, and the reason they had similar senses of humor and liked the same things, and looked so dramatically similar, is because they were literally sisters. They just didn't know it. And then one day they took a series of selfie photos of themselves, and Cassidy, she would go home and show one of those photos to her parents and say, hey, look, my best friend, Misha Solomon, look how similar we look. And when Cassidy's parents looked at Misha Solomon, they instinctively knew, that is our daughter. That is Zephany Nurse. And so they would bring this photo to the police, and the police would begin to investigate. And during this investigation, they began trailing Misha. So when Misha's aunt told Misha that she thought a white car was following her, she wasn't just being paranoid. Those were investigators following Misha around, trying to get a feel for her schedule, because they needed to approach her when she was alone in order to get a DNA sample. They were worried if they contacted Misha and tipped off what they were doing, she would tell her parents, who were actually her kidnappers, and then potentially they might take Misha and run away. And so they couldn't risk that. They had to basically follow her around and wait for an opening to get this DNA test done. And so this was also the reason why Cassidy was acting so strangely towards Misha in the few days before the truth was revealed. It's because Cassidy knew about this investigation, and the police told her, you can't tip Misha off. She will tell her parents, her kidnappers, and they might abscond with her. And so Cassidy basically felt awkward and kind of just hid from Misha for a couple of days. The woman that Misha had grown up with and called her mom for her whole life, LaVonna Solomon, was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years in prison. There has never been any evidence to suggest that LaVonna's husband, so Misha's dad for her whole life, actually knew that the baby had been kidnapped, because 17 years earlier, LaVonna had been pregnant with their child. But it's believed she miscarried, and LaVonna did not share that with her husband. Instead, she told her husband that she had gone into labor while he was at work and delivered their child, and so that's how they had this baby, Zephany, when in reality, after LaVonna had miscarried, she had at some point dressed up like a nurse, gone into the hospital, and stolen Zephany. For her part, Zephany, aka Misha, stayed in touch with both sets of parents, the fake ones and her biological ones. And she would say that, she still loves the parents who kidnapped her because they raised her and they treated her well. And in fact, Zephany would actually wear that beautiful flowing red dress that LaVonna had stitched for her to her high school dance well after the news came out about who LaVonna was. Misha also decided that she would just keep the name Misha because that was what she was used to, instead of going back to her baby name, Zephany.
A distant light begins to rise, one heartbeat, one shared dream alive. Every step keeps moving on, tomorrow calls us toward the door. Through the streets that never sleep, every turn a promise we keep, hand in hand we pass the spark, light and hope beyond the dark.
burning through the lines. Outside the storm breaks over the city, but in here the heartbeat still climbs. Voices cut the waves of thunder. Stay on the line, we're on our way. No one sees, the eyes grow tired. Only the light that won't fade away. Every second feels like signals breaking. One wrong step could shift the world. There are souls who never sleep here, so others wake up safe and home. The tide, it brings you in, then lets you go. I know I should get back my mother's dress. Old medals that you earned, they mean much less. Early morning, set my sails back to shore. Paradise return, useless metaphor. I'm out there in the swamp trying hard to start. The gasoline.
That was until the man glanced ahead at the fallen tree ahead of him, and before he saw